And welcome back. In this tutorial we'll talk about another type of animation, which is more something I would call perhaps a morphing, or actually not so much a morphing, but just a transition from one image to another. And to exemplify that, I thought we would take an image from an artist. Her name is Brianna. Actually, that's her artist name, and you can see her galleries at Daz and at Renderosity. And here is a portion of an image that I thought we would go through a couple of different filters to show different variations, and then decide, okay, I like this one and I like this one. How can I do a transition? How can I do a sort of an animation, right? The whole topic is still about animation, but animation of what? So we can do a number of tricks with this. And one of them would be simply to take a starting image and then transition into an ending image. Right? And so here's a couple of ways to do that. Let's remember this initial image, that's this one here. And then we've done a variety of little experiments going through filter. From the filters menu, you'll find a variety of options to adjust hue, saturation, color. I did not do too many of those. I did a couple of photographic filters with light diffusion, soft contrast improvement, star filter, fish eye I didn't do, but there's plenty to explore. And there's also a lot of artistic filters, adding some wet paint. You might, for instance, want to do wet paint like this, but that's not. This one's going vertically, and maybe you'd like to show wet paint going sideways. If you have a splitting headache, which this pose might imply, you might say, I'm going to see everything going split sideways. And so one thing I could do is simply go to the image and first rotate that. There's my rotation, go by 90 degrees. And so here she is, and now I can go to the filter menu all the same. And under the artistic filter, apply that wet paint. And now it's going still vertically, right? And I can go one way or the other, have the darker pixels going down, or have the lighter colors going down. And let's say I want this one here. In fact, I could do two and then combine the two. Yeah, let's do that. So I'm going to go okay that, store that. And so here's one. And never mind the distortion, it's not keeping the aspect ratio in this preview, but it obviously has it in the original. Now I'm going to undo the transform and reapply the same filter, but go in the other direction. So I'm going to go for artistic, wet paint, and go the other direction. Right? And okay that. And that one I will store as well, because I want to be able to work with both of them side by side. So now the question is, how do I combine those two? Well, you can put one in one layer, the other one in the other layer, and then do a combination, a blended type of layering. Or you can load one in the main image, that's this one here. Let's say I click on this first this first stored copy. And then I switch over to the second image where I have something else from prior experiments, and I'm going to click the second stored copy, and that one is in the swap image. You can see here in the top it will show whether you're looking at the swap image or whether you're looking at the main image, and click back for the main image. And now you want to see them both together. One thing you can do is here basically enable what we call layer mixing or swap blending, and by default this one's a multiply mode. If you right click that same icon, you can see a couple of other ways to blend them. All right, so traditional screen blending, you can do a couple of others, green screen, so anything that's green on one will become transparent, anything else is opaque. Magic pink, there's quite a bit of pink there. Linear dodge, experiment with those a little bit. Exclusion, there's a variety of strange effects you can get there, and you'll probably find, no doubt you'll find something that kind of expresses the mood that you're looking for. And so let's say we want this one, right? So I'm going to right click one more more time here and say merge with swap, so the two are now merged together. And then at that point I could go and say, well, that's nice, but it's a little bit too strong an effect. Let's see if I can undo that effect. That's called the interactive undo, or blending or fading the most recent action, fade last action. That's what it would be called up here on the filter, fade last action, same thing. So that's an interesting option to basically combine two different images that are variants of the same original, and then some, right? I mean, you can then say, okay, let's rotate it back. We initially rotated it clockwise, now let's go counterclockwise, and there she is, and we can zoom in a little bit with Control and Shift, and then so at that point we might want to perhaps add additional filters like color embossing to make it an even stronger presence of these horizontal shifted portions. And you might want to go bring back the original as well. Click on that and use the interactive undo to fade between the two. Kind of have a twin sister mirror image showing here, right? Or again, that would be something you can also quite nicely control if you put it in a separate layer. So let's look at that quickly. You have the layers in the sidebar, and so I'm going to keep this image. Let's store this image. We're probably going to need this one safely there somewhere. These two we don't need anymore. Let's just minimize them. And so we have this image with the splitting headache, and we have this one here. And so what I'm going to do is put the original here in the first layer. That's the main image. And then I'm going to add a layer and put this one in. And that one is by default in multiply mode as well. But what's different between this and the prior approach when we were going through the swap image is that we can actually adjust that blended layer here already. There is a slider that lets you control how much of the blending you want, and then still have those many different layer mixing modes like tracing paper, and adjust how much of that tracing paper you want. So there's a ton of filters. There's not just a ton of filters, but there's a ton of ways to combine the result of one filter against another. And so here's perhaps a few more. We've done greater than. So that's an interesting one because you kind of get part of an image in some areas, and then the rest of it is dominated by the other image. Just wherever the second layer image here is brighter, it will dominate. So one thing you could do is actually, if you wanted to have more of it showing, is to go to perhaps temporarily disable it, turn the visibility off, and then go back to that one here and make it darker. Right? One way to make it darker would be, for instance, to go to the adjust color level and reduce some of the tones here. Even change the tone altogether with that, but just reducing it, multiplying it with a lesser amount of red, green, and blue will give you a much darker picture of it, and so you can give it a bit of a reddish tint to that. Let's say we now want to bring back this layer on top, and that one now has a much wider range of pixels that are brighter, so you can adjust it to actually show more of that as well. Anyway, so that's one of the many ways that you can combine things. Let's now do a switcheroo, so to speak. I'm going to go and add one more layer, and I'm going to take this image, store it like so, and then switch back to the new layer on top and put that one in here. Don't need this one anymore now. And then I'm going to dismiss this one in the back, the lowest level image. In fact, I'm going to delete this. So delete this layer. And, oh, well, maybe not. So I guess I need to bring it up. So let's go bring it upstairs. This one here we will keep. This one we don't need anymore. So let's go and delete it now. Delete layer. There. So now we have these two images, and I've done the switcheroo in the sense that the one here is now the one at the bottom, and the one here is the one on top. And what I can do is now adjust how much that one is visible. If I make it a screen level blending, or I need to switch it actually there. So you can do a number of gimmicks that are different now, right? Rather than subtracting or blending A from B, you do B from A if you have image 1, image 2, or image A, image 2. But you can also do more things that, other than blending them, you can have things like displacing them, right? So one thing I wanted to show, instead of putting that just in the layer, let's again put it into the swap image, right? And when you have it in the swap image, you might do the following. So I'm going to delete these layers here. Let's go make sure we have a snapshot of this. There you go. So we have the darker, slightly tinted version, and I'm not going to need this layer anymore for this part of the demo. So we have this image here, and in the swap image I want the darker one here, like that, right? And what I want to do is, or maybe even the lighter one, what I want to do is actually use this image as a way to displace this image, right? So that's yet another thing you can do, is to say, well, I want sort of this tonality. I don't want to change the coloring. I just want to show that splitting headache effect by shifting pixels sideways based on kind of this image. And perhaps to better exemplify it, rather than a colored version, we might use a grayscale version. So let me go to the grayscale. Exposed through lens is my favorite grayscale, because you can kind of work with many different types of grayscale effects here. And let's say I'm going to go with something like this, and give it the full dynamic range. Go to image and expand dynamic range. Make sure we have totally black and totally white areas. Full dynamic range is in effect. And then I'm switching back, and now I'm going to have this image displaced by this one. And we could do the opposite. We could take this one and have it displaced by that one. But this is the one where we recognize the tonality. So let me see what I do here under filter, displace by swap, right? I am in one image. Well, okay, I'm looking at swap. I could actually switch to two, but it's basically looking at the other image, swap or main image, and displacing one by the other. So here's a generic displace mode, and you can see what that does, right? Not necessarily pretty. That's what the splitting headache is supposed to convey. There is also a couple of other styles. The cloaking displace, that's interesting if you want to see a little bit of a coloration, discoloration. It's very subtle here in this case. Let's go to pool displace, which we use a lot for the terrain modeling, to create sort of a stratification effect on some of the vertical or steep slopes of the mountains. In this case here, we get again that splitting going sideways, but the coloration remains the same. So that's pretty much the effect I'm looking for here. Let's see if we can get another one. Let's undo this, and there are one or two more under displace by swap. There's a jitter displace, and that will add a jittering, a jittered appearance to it, and so that also can be very, very fascinating, interesting at times, especially if afterwards you want to do some additional blurring. It has prepared the pixels to be blurred even more randomly, it would seem. Another thing you could do is one last one here, I think. Oh, there's two more: color twirl displays and normal displays. So color twirl displays has yet another set of interesting distortion effects. I mean, you could see this. You could see using this, for instance, to you know, let's say you're developing a game, or developing, I don't know, some video, some storyline, and this person is what you see on a video screen, on a computer screen, on a television screen, and you want to show the video signal being disturbed or disrupted, and poor communication or electronic interference or something like that, right? So there are additional video lines you might want to show, and we have some filters for that to add that on top, and then soon enough you get a very interesting looking still of the entire distortion effect. Let's go one more here. We have displace by swap, we had normal displace, and that's just yet another one. So you can see there's a lot of different, very different effects that you can create. And likewise, let me store this one. I like this one. Let's go store. There you go. And likewise, we have a variety of different tonalities we can show. Effects simply due to using the soft contrast improvement or using the light diffusion, a little bit of blur, a little bit of sharpening. This one here is what we call art sharpen, under filter, sharpen, art sharpen, and that one has the options to reduce the color count. So you get, and you can always, don't stop there, add some more dynamic range or brightness or contrast and so on. And here is one with a bristle applied to the colors. So that's under this the artistic collection where we do brush strokes, and the brush strokes can have many different styles or lengths and density of brush strokes, maximum length of them. So a lot of different, very different results from that. Maximum angle. Make it perhaps something a little bit more sideways looking, have it as lines or anti-aliased lines, gradient lines, and then be careful with this one here, caution here, because that one can take quite a while. That uses your current brush, and if your brush is of a very particular construct, it may take a long time to render that brush along each of those pixels. So enough said. We have a lot of actually I like this one here. Let's keep this one as well. Let's go and store this. So we have a great number of choices now to get back to what we really wanted to do, which is to create an animation, and that animation would be of a different nature from what we've seen before. Right, we want to do an animation where we transition from one image to the other, and maybe even through 2, 3, 4 more. Right. Here's a woodcut print kind of look. This one is taking it into a 3D render with the not with the Puppy Ray, but with the 3D designer. And here are two that we just did. So let's say we wanted to have an animation where we go from this to that original, back and forth. Right. So what we'll do is we'll take that initial image and we'll say, well, we'll probably need at least 2 frames. Right. So we'll create an animation with at least 2 frames. And let's think big and look forward and say, let's give it 4, let's give it a few more. Right. So we'll do 4 frames, and initially we have, let me go minimize this, move this down a little bit. Initially we have every frame being a copy of that current one, but now we can go and say, well, here's the 3rd frame. In this one we actually want this one to be used. Same thing for the 4th frame, we want this one to be used. So you just click those stored copies and you have quickly populated the images you actually want in there. And that's where you could actually say, well, okay, number 1 is fine. Number 2, before I get to number 3, I want yet another appearance. I want this one, and then I want this one, and then for number 4 I might want yet something different, maybe this. Right, so you can easily create a slideshow with that, right? And then it's just a matter of playing it. Now this one by default will play it pretty quickly. So you'll want to go into FPS, frames per second, and reduce that maybe to 1. So you have 1 frame a second, right? Or you have 2 frames a second, and 3 to go a little bit faster. But that's just the playback speed. That did not produce more frames or fewer frames or something like that. Eventually, if you want to have this be part of a video clip that plays at 30 frames a second, you're going to be looking at something like this unless you do something about it. You want to add more frames. You want to extend it so that it does a time stretching, right? So that's what we'll do right now here. We'll take this and load the same image, take this one and load this same image. We have just these 2, and we'll do a transition. All right. So how do we do that again? We do right click on this timeline, or we go to the animation menu and look for the frames. This is frame level editing, right? So we'll go to the frames of the animation, right click on that, and look at time stretch. Right, so that's one approach to do it. Before I go into that, let's make sure we have a safe copy of this animation. It's a very short one, so we can store it, and it's not a safe copy really. It's not saved to file if we store it to memory. but we can store it to disk, and that's going to make it all the much a little bit safer. And so now we can go and apply that time stretch. Let's go to animation, and simply with the time stretch, where do we go? That's under the frame level animation, of course, there, time stretch. And so we have currently 4 frames. How many do we want? Well, if the whole animation needs to last 4 seconds at 30 frames per second, that's 4 times 30, that's 120 frames total. So we can actually put that right in there. Right? And so if we did that without frame blending, it would simply hold each frame a second long, 30 frames long. Right? So let's take a look at that quick. And so now you see that there are a number of frames that are all identical, and then eventually we'll see a transition from one to the next. And so many frames here are the same until suddenly, somewhere in the middle, we see a very subtle transition here. Right? So you can see right there is that transition. Okay? And so that's to be expected at frame number 60. We have frame number 59. The first 60 frames from 0 to 59 were the replicated sequence. But there's no blending here, there's no transition. You see that sudden jump from one to the other. It lasts 2 seconds because we had 2 frames at that same image, and then the next 2 frames at the second image, and it stays there for 2 seconds. But that's an animation, you know. And let's go back now and click the stored copy I had done here with just the 4 frames before I did anything to it. Let's go store that, restore the animation, and see how else we can do an animation with this. And so what we'll do in this case is to give it actually that blended transition, right? And so what I'll do is I'll say again time stretch, but this time with the frame blending. All right. So this frame blending, how many frames do we want? Total 120, same thing as before, but this time with frame blending. Let's go. And so now we actually see a gradual transition, right? Because we're blending from one frame to the next frame. Now we're not doing that right away because the first and the second frame were the same, and then the third to the fourth frame were also the same. So you don't see any transition between these two. It is effectively blending, but it's going from a 1 pixel color to the next same pixel color across these 2 frames. So there is a little bit of a hold before you actually see a transition. And now you see that transition in the middle. Now this is not a looping animation because at the very end we are on frame number 2, whereas here we are on frame number 1. So when we reach the end and we loop back to the beginning, we have that sudden jump here, right, as we go across the border. What we could do now is look at other ways to blend between the two. Let's do the following here. I'm going to create a new animation with just 2 frames. Right? And with those 2 frames, I'm going to go put one like this one here, and then go to the next frame and put this one in. And so now this one here is going to be interesting because they're very different, you know, in terms of color, richness, and it's just a very different image. In fact, we can make it even more different if we apply additional transform. Like this one here is, you know, you can see it's a different size, different position, different angle. And so that's going to be a very different effect. But here too, we can go and time stretch it. Time stretch, there it is, and say we need that to be 60 seconds long, 60 frames long, meaning it making it 2 seconds with frame blending. And so here we have now a little bit of a transition. But that one you can tell is really showing that they are transitioning from one to another very different image. You can tell that 30 frames that we use to blend from one to the other, there is a bit of a ghosting scenario that you can see, where you can see one image, but you can also see the other one still. I mean, that's what we're asking you to do. You know, don't get me wrong. This is expected, but it is not a very nice transition because it is you know, it is so visible, and you might want to have a little bit more of a subtle move. And sometimes instead of doing a purely frame blended transition, you might want to try the motion interpolated transition. Now I can tell you this is probably not going to work here too well. It's going to look like it's doing some very noisy morphing. Why? Because these are very different images. And so, the motion interpolation or motion estimated transition works well when you have an image followed by another one that are somewhat similar. These are not similar. In terms of topology, these are very different. But let's try it nonetheless. Let's go back to just 2 images. Let's go and create an animation. Or let's give it a few more, maybe 3 or 4, something like that, and actually populate a couple of them here. Let's put this one here as the first one, put this one in as the second one, this one, and finally this one. So we have a couple of images here, and I don't know if they'll all be seen at the end after the motion interpolation. There's always some border or edge condition where something happens to the last frame, right, or to the first frame. But what we'll do is we'll take a look at it. Here's the filter, and this time we'll go to the animated collection, and there is a motion prediction module here. So what the motion prediction module wants you to do is choose a grid that you can adjust here. 12 is the default, and that grid defines a layout of tiles. You see each square there, each little square represents where we'll place a motion tracker, right? So each of those little squares, we will grab a copy of it and put a motion tracker on it, and then try to see did we detect in the next frame where that tile moved to. And good luck finding it, because we're not going to find it in this case, right? The next frame is very different from one image to the next one here. So it's going to do a bit of a morphing gimmick here. As we experiment with that, first let's do the dry run, so it's not actually saving it. But let's go give it a try with the default of 3 tweens. That means it's not going to have many more frames. Initially 4, probably about a dozen after that, right? 3 tweens between them, give or take a few. So what we'll do is we'll just experiment with that and see what that gives us. Well, that was a very big flash. Let's go something a little bit longer. Let's give it 22 tweens. That will take a little bit longer for it to calculate it. So now you can see that there is some sort of a morphing happening, which is in itself interesting, right? This is another dimension which you can do and explore to see. Let's give it like 55 and make it spread over 111 frames. So you can see how now it's not just blending, but it's also doing sort of a weird distortion transition or transformation. Let's give it a lot here, 222. So that's going to be probably a few hundred there, 445 frames. Now you really get to see what's going on here. And hey, maybe that's cool. Maybe that's exactly the effect you're looking for. So go for it. Then undo the dry run and make it so. So I wanted to just show you this as yet another type of animation, right? Another way to create an animation. Now remember, at the very end of this motion prediction module operation, the last frame is the same as the first frame. That's one of the side effects of our algorithm. We'll just delete that first one. It got copied from the last. And you notice also that the very first frame actually is not showing anymore. Remember, we had this image in the first frame. We seem to have lost it, right? So it actually seems to be skipping that. And if we wanted that first frame here to also be part of that entire game, we would need to have it twice there, right? So because right now we don't have it, and we're animating to this number 3 and number 4, and that was it. So let's go and recreate just the way we need it, right? The first image, we'll say we want this, or maybe we want this one. There you go. Then let's close this motion prediction module for now. Then we wanted this one. Then we wanted this one. And then we wanted, let's say, this one. But again, this first one we need to duplicate. Alright, so let's go insert another frame. And it will be a copy. Let's scroll back here. You can see now it's a copy of the one we were right on. So we have 2 here. That will allow us to hopefully not lose both of them. Just one will be lost, but we will have this one to start from, and the animation will go to this one, and then go to this one, and so on. In fact, this one is too strong. I'm going to go take one that's a little bit less extreme. Let's do this one. and then we'll go to this, and then to this, and then to this, and I want to add one more, this one here. Alright, and heck, one more, this one here. Alright, so we have a couple of frames. The first one is duplicated because we saw that it was not going to use that first frame, and we want that first frame, so we need to just duplicate it. And then we go here. All this stuff that we have at the end here from the prior experiment, from the prior time stretch or motion prediction execution, we need to get rid of. So I'm going to select all of these. I'm going to say select from here, set the in marker, set in, right click on that, and then go to the last frame and set the out marker. You can do that here as well. And so now we have this blue highlight box here indicating which frames are selected, and you can cut them all simply by right click here and say delete block. That entire blue block is being deleted. That's not the only way to do this, but I like that technique. Gives me time to sip on my coffee in between a few seconds it takes, and and then once we have it down to just the 6 or 7 frames, those are the ones we want to work from. So let's go and again store this animation. There we go. And this short animation now needs to become a long animation. So let's go to filter, animated, motion prediction module, and rip it, so to speak. Let's do the dry run. Let's decide how big those tiles are going to go. You know what, I'm just going to use the default. 12 is fine usually. Now, one thing also about this motion prediction module is that each of the motion trackers that we put on these tiles is going to look around in its neighborhood, right? Each of them has a neighborhood in which it thinks the next position is going to be found. So it's going to look around, and you can control how far it is allowed to look, right? This here is sort of a search distance that you can control. You can kind of get an idea of roughly the diagonal distance that it may travel to go look for to look for itself or the best, closest match in this neighborhood. All around it, not just downwards but also upwards, but by the same distance. And in fact, if you want to see what it detects, one thing you can do is show the motion vectors, and it will be little lines or make it even arrows. And so let's go and turn this into, let's say, 44 times, yep, and yep. Okay, so now you see some red stuff happening here that indicates in which direction it sees the movement going for each of those tiles. This is a classy little mode to understand motion prediction or motion estimation, and I just love it because it really shows some interesting aspects of that. So let's go without all that and see what kind of deformation we get there. Let's go even slower. What did we do last time? 200 or so. Now we have more frames this time, so let's be careful. But this is still in dry run. We're not actually going to allocate memory to store this entire animation yet. So we don't have to worry yet about possibly running out of memory. But we could possibly see that happen when we uncheck the dry run and let it actually go into storing it in memory. Now I happen to know that this is a relatively small image. It's only about 400 or 500 pixels in dimension. We can see that here on the image info. 524 wide, 282, so relatively small, and 1000 frames is not going to kill us. So I'm going to uncheck that. Actually, before that, there's one more thing I might want to do, and adjust the fudge factor and some other parameters here. Let's see if perhaps we like the visual effects of that a little bit better. We might not notice much of the difference, but it's at times it will be less noisy and a little bit more blended. If you increase it, that's actually a recommendation if you have very noisy video to begin with, right? But let's see what we get here with that. You could also spend some more time by refining passes and all sorts of other, like multiple samples, not needed here. Let's go and make it so. And in a few seconds now you have an animation of 1000 frames, whereas before you just had 5 or 6 frames, right? So that's the magic about this, is that you can do some rather drastic modifications. Let's delete that first frame, and now we do have that original image immediately going into a transition and blending through that. Let's go set the frames per second to 60. I want to rush through this, and let's go close the motion prediction module and play this. So now you can see it at 60 frames a second, which is still fairly slow. Right, so that's another scenario. Sometimes we just went through making it slow. Maybe we want to do the opposite. Maybe we want to actually work with this animation that's a little bit too long and we want to shorten it. Now you may have, for instance, rendered an animation in, I don't know, Carrara, Lightwave, your 3D programs, and you've rendered it to be 5 seconds long, and now you realize, oh, I need a shorter version. I need one that's just 2 seconds long or 2.5 seconds, right? Well, that's something we can do too. And that's actually a little bit easier to do, because one thing you can do at that point is simply right click and do the same thing we did before, called time stretch, but go in the opposite direction. Right? You might not even want to do the frame blending. You might want to just say skip every other frame. So divide by 2, you're now going down to half the number of frames. Divide by 2 again, you're now down to a quarter of the original frame count. Now at that point, it might be interesting to also have the frame blending. So let's do that and get it to animate a little bit faster and not have too much lost here. But anyway, so that's summarizing some of the animation techniques I wanted to cover in this tutorial, where you can do transitions of very different things. And to finalize it, one thing I'll do is something very, very simple. Right? What I'll do is I'll create an animation, and this animation will have just 3 frames, and it will be not of a copy of the current frame. It will be clear to the secondary color. And there we go. Alright, so here's our 3 frames that are blank. And on the first frame, I'm not going to have anything. On the second frame, I'm going to have a filled circle. So I'm going to go to the circle tool here, and it will be reddish. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit to see my entire image. There you go. And then I'm going to put my reddish circle here, Soleil Rouge, Konnichiwa. And now I'm going to go to the next frame, and this one will be a hollow circle. And so I'm going to go to the oval tool I used before, but it's on the upper left corner of it. This is a tool that's kind of a two-faced tool. It's got the upper left and the lower right corner of it, triggering different modes. So the upper left, the same thing for the rectangular tool here. So the upper left will give you a unfilled ellipse. The lower right will give you a filled oval or ellipse. And so you can see now I can do something like this. Now I'd like to see where my prior oval went. Right, this one here. I don't have good visual memory. When I go back to this one, I don't remember how far it went. Right? So what I'll do instead is ask Howler to tell me, to show me. There's a thing called the onion skin. It's right here. This is a little table. It's also known as a light table. And toggling the light table allows you to see the prior frame. In fact, it allows you to see more than the prior frame. If you are on that frame, you see it at full intensity. But if you're on the frame before or the frame after, you'll see it at a reduced intensity. And in fact, there's more. If you had additional frames, you would see a few more of those, 2 or 3 now, before and up to 3 next to that. But what we'll do is we'll go to this one here, and that will give us a visual clue or cue on where actually our filled circle is. And I'm going to get these guys out of the way just so I can get, or maybe minimize these, just so I can get a little bit more visible space here for my image. With the control and the shift key down, I can move it around with the left button and zoom in with the right button. And that allows me to get a closer look to this full-size circle, but I am still not on the circle itself. I'm on this frame, and I'm going to click around here now, and now I can see my circle around like this. Now I'm not a very good shot at that, so I might need to do this a few times or shift it. Right? I mean, one way to do this is to get it wrong and then correct it, or get it wrong and do it again. So I'm going to go actually do this. I'm going to go get it wrong, a little bit extra wrong, like this, so you can see there's a little bit missed area here. And then I'm going to use the shift tool, filter, transform, where is it? Transform, shift, and use my hand here to move this image around. Now it's going to replicate, it's going to wrap around one way or the other, so don't shift it too much, but you can use with that a fairly decent match, if it is possible, if it actually has a shape that will cover it. And so that's one thing, one way to bring that circle outline. Now this one's very fuzzy because my default brush is a little bit of a fuzzy nature. It's sort of a soft, you see this image here, that's the image in my brush. And I'd like to perhaps give it more of a very graphic design type of display. So there is another type of use for this hollow oval. Rather than blending it or drawing the current brush along it, you'll see there is another way. So I'm going to go and undo that or simply clear it. And that frame is clear, and I'm going to go and use the same tool again, the hollow circle oval, and you now see that there are other options. There is a mode, there's the opacity, there's the fill shape, anti-alias crosshair. There's a couple of others that I'm looking for. Where did I put them? Might not be here. There's the natural media lines. Oh, that's for the line drawing. I thought we had that also for the circle. I may be mistaken. But we do have... yeah, okay, so here we go. We have fill shape. We have some other modes by which that circle can actually go in there. We could do something like a screen mode. And let's go and see, for instance, if we actually even change the color to like a bluish tint. Well, there's really not a whole lot to it, but we can see that it's going to blend in a slightly different fashion here. But that sometimes can help also identify where you want to actually place it. There's some fill settings, there's some gradients. Let's not get sidetracked too much about that. Let's disable the onion skin, and we now have our third image. Remember, the first image we need to possibly replicate if we want to actually have it transition from blank to red and then to blue outline. But if we don't care about this one, that's okay. We will do a blended transition between these two. Right? So let's go. This is sort of a repeat now. Animated motion prediction module. Just 3 frames, of which we know the first one will not be relevant, will not be retained. Let's give it 444 tweens. So we have just 2 frames of real interest here, and we're going to stretch them 444 times. And of course that's going to be a really interesting sort of a transition, because we really don't have similarities here in the images. But that's the nature of it. You can use it and you can abuse it as well. So here I'm going to go and OK that and create a transition, sort of a motion predicted or motion estimated transition going from one to the other. And that will be all for now. We will see more in the next tutorial where we'll use a very different type of image, but we will still do an animation where the image is going to be moving rather than blending between different images. One thing you may want to also do is to move an image, like, or move or pan through the image, move across that image. Imagine a large background image and you want to use it, but you want to not keep looking at the same background portion. You want to transition it a little bit. Something very easily done now, since we know how to work with these frames. Right, see you later.